Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to AP Macroeconomics. I'm Jen Rayfield, and I'll be going through our lesson on topic 6.4 this evening. So let me just bring up our PowerPoint for tonight, and we will go ahead and get started. Okay, so again, I'm coming to you from New Jersey, where I work at Ridge High School, and our topic for this evening is the effect of changes in policies and economic conditions on the foreign exchange market. And this is going to really build on what you did yesterday with Mr. Romano when you looked at foreign exchange markets. So one of our goals tonight is to explain the determinants of currency demand and supply using graphs as appropriate. So we're going to spend a lot of time with that Forex graph today. We also want to be able to explain how changes in the demand and supply of in the foreign exchange market are going to affect the equilibrium exchange rate or currency values in the market. So our focus for tonight is skill 4C, which asks students to be able to demonstrate the effect of a change in an economic situation on an accurately labeled graph or visual. So by now you've probably learned two things. One, Unit 6, International Trade and Open Economy is not going to be on the 2020 AP Macroeconomics exam. And you've probably also been informed by your teacher that the testing platform for this year and the free response questions you're going to be asked to answer during your at-home 45-minute test are not going to include graphs. So you're probably like, okay, well, what good is staying online tonight? I'd like to hopefully give you some compelling reasons. One, this is really going to review a lot of fiscal and monetary policy. It's also going to review economic conditions in ways that are going to be really helpful for you on the AP exam. So that's one good reason. Second, even if you don't have to produce a graph in your answer to an AP macro FRQ this year, I can't imagine that being able to use the graphs as tools won't be of major benefit to you when you're preparing an answer to a question. I can't teach economics without drawing. I can't talk about economics without graphs, and I certainly can't answer either multiple choice or free response questions without them. So making sure you can use a foreign exchange graph is a great skill. Making sure you understand currency valuations is an important component in being a global economic citizen. And again, focusing on these graphs is really going to help fine tune your ability to use a model as a tool to be able to describe, predict, and explain economic phenomena, which is what you will be doing on the AP macro exam. All right, so by the end of this lesson, you'll know that you understand the topic when you can recognize a determinant of demand for or supply of a currency in a foreign exchange market, and you can use the foreign exchange graph to predict how those changes in demand or supply will affect exchange rates. Also, the goal is to connect fiscal and monetary policy to the economic conditions that influence international trade. So this is really a putting it all together lesson for tonight. So we're going to pick up where we left off yesterday. Mr. Romano showed you, again, parts A and B from the 2014 question 3. So we worked through this question a few days ago, and now we're going to add part C to it. So you'll remember the prompt. We start with the United States and South Korea as trading partners. We know that the United States has a zero current account balance, and we're asked to assume that the inflation rate in the U.S. decreases relative to the inflation rate in South Korea. So we worked through this problem the other day, but based on the decreases in the inflation rate, will U.S. exports to South Korea increase or decrease? The answer is they will increase. And based on the change in U.S. exports, will the U.S. current account balance remain at zero, be in a surplus, or be in a deficit? And we know that when imports increase because they're credits to the current account, it's going to move towards a surplus. And then the question is what happens to real GDP in the US in the short run? And we concluded that it's going to increase because higher exports leads to an increase in aggregate demand because exports are part of aggregate spending in the country. It's spending by foreigners on domestic goods and services. All right, so now part C was a foreign exchange question. And we're told that the South Korean currency is the won, and we're asked to draw a correctly labeled graph of the foreign exchange market for the US dollar and to show the effect of the lower inflation rate in the US on the won price per dollar, on the won price per US dollar. So we want to pay very careful attention when we're using foreign exchange graphs to determine currency values or exchange rates. We want to pay careful attention to which model we're going to be using. As you learned last night, anytime there is an increase in the supply of one currency, it's in order to be able to demand more of another currency, and vice versa. So we want to make sure that we're using the right model so that we're looking at the correct exchange rate. So here's how you would approach answering to this question. Remember that the foreign exchange model is the model is a market, uh, where we're modeling the supply of and the demand for something based on its price. In this case, it's the supply and demand of currency based on the price of that currency, and the price of the currency is the exchange rate. So I recommend my students, when they're learning to use Forex models, they always start by labeling price and quantity, and then figure out, okay, the price of which currency are we looking at? Which currency are we being asked to value? So in this case, we want to show the effect of the lower inflation rate in the US on the won price per US dollar, right? So we're looking at the market for the dollar. So we want the price of the dollar and the quantity of dollars. That's going to be how we label our axes. And again, the price of $1 will help you intuit the exchange rate, I think, pretty well. And then finally, it's the price of a dollar in what? Well, it's in won because that's the foreign currency that we're valuing the dollar in terms of. So we have a downward sloping demand for dollars, curve, an upward sloping supply of dollars curve. And we find our initial equilibrium exchange rate at where the supply and the demand intersect. So let's use some reasoning to figure out which curve to shift, and then all we have to do is shift the curve and read the graph to find out what happens to the exchange rate. We've done all the hard work. Okay, so when US exports to South Korea increase, in order to purchase more US goods and services, South Koreans must first purchase US dollars. So that's going to cause an increase in the demand for dollars. Does that make sense? In order to buy more dollar denominated goods, you need more dollars. So we're going to increase the demand for dollars. And if the demand for something goes up, all else equal, we've already learned in multiple other markets that the price of it's going to go up. So when we increase the demand for the US dollar, we see an increase in the exchange rate. The won price per dollar rises. Okay, the price of $1 in won is going up. So that's how you would answer that question. So if this was something that you want to see again, don't worry, we're going to be looking at it more closely, and we'll be using these Forex graphs quite a lot tonight. All right, so I want to point out something. I want to reconcile the labels here. We're looking at the value of a currency on the vertical axis, the price of the currency in terms of some other currency. So you want to make sure you're looking at the price of dollars and the quantity of dollars. And you can also label the vertical axis as won per dollar. But if you put these symbols in reverse order, then you will not be correctly identifying what happens to the exchange rate. So understanding how to label this axis is pretty important. So we have a supply of a dollar, demand for the dollar, and equilibrium quantity of dollars, and the equilibrium exchange rate for dollars. So just notice that they all agree. The price of the dollar, the supply of the dollar, the demand for the dollar, and the quantity of dollars. If we label with fidelity and consistency, this becomes a much more useful tool to us. Now, this exchange rate, this symbol E, stands for the exchange rate of won per dollar, right? It's the number of won needed to buy $1. So when we have and so I actually looked at the exchange rates. So I looked at, this was a 2014 question. So I looked up the won per dollar exchange rate from April 8th, 2014. And what I learned was that it cost 1,000 and roughly 25 won to purchase $1 6 years ago. All right, so when we have our increase in demand, the exchange rate rises. It means that the purchasing power of the won relative to the dollar decreases. It means you're going to need more won to buy each US dollar. So the won per dollar is going to increase. Okay, the number of won needed to buy $1 is going to increase. So now that means that this number up here has to be bigger than 1,025. So just like the price of anything, when we move up the vertical axis, we see the price increasing. We want to see that the price of a dollar in won is increasing too. So as of this afternoon, the won price per dollar was 1,217 won. So 6 years ago, it cost about 1,000 won to buy $1. dollar. Today it costs about 1,200. So obviously the dollar has gotten more expensive in terms of won. The dollar has appreciated. Okay. All right, so one more thing to review before we get into it, and this is from last night. Mr. Romano taught you that the determinants of flexible exchange rates are relative income changes, relative inflation rates, relative real interest rates, and changes in expectations of future income or prices, changes in expectations of future interest rates, and changes in expectations of future exchange rates. So the three big ones that show up again and again and again on the AP macro exam and are changes in relative income, relative inflation rates, and relative real interest rates. So that's where we're going to focus this evening, okay? And then, of course, we're going to talk ultimately about how fiscal and monetary policies affect relative income, relative inflation rates, and relative real interest rates. And that's sort of putting it all together for us. All right, so there's three essential knowledge statements associated with topic 6.4, and this is the first one. Factors that shift the demand for a currency and the supply of a currency change the equilibrium exchange rate. So that's something you need to know in order to be able to use Forex graphs to describe how changes in supply or demand are going to affect the exchange rate. So let's just sort of really generalize excuse me, what drives demand for a currency. And I think this is a key point. So we have really two forces, the desire to purchase goods and services denominated in that currency. So for example, if there's an increase in the desire to own Swiss watches, that's going to cause foreign purchasers of Swiss watches to demand Swiss francs, because unless you're a currency speculator, in which case you're buying a currency as a financial asset, you're buying the currency in order to purchase a good or a service. And so that's really important to understand. Right? It's also the demand for a currency is a function of the desire to purchase financial assets denominated in that currency. So we're talking about bonds, we're talking about other interest-bearing assets, stocks, other equities that generate income. So the desire to purchase financial assets denominated in a given currency are going to drive demand for that currency. So this example, the desire for European Central Bank bonds would cause foreign purchasers of ECB bonds to demand euros. Now, what drives the supply of a currency? And it's really kind of simple. It's the desire to purchase a foreign currency. So if I want to buy a good or service in another country, if I want to purchase a financial asset in another country, I'm going to supply my domestic currency in the foreign exchange market in order to be able to buy the foreign currency. So, you know, a real broad generalization of what drives the supply of currency, it's the desire to purchase a foreign currency. So because remember that in order to purchase that foreign currency, you have to supply your domestic currency first. So the really important conclusions to draw from this is that currency exchange facilitates economic transactions between buyers in one nation and sellers in another, regardless of which way the transaction is going. And so changes in the demand for and supply of a currency are a function of underlying economic activity. So when you're asked about the effect of a change in economic conditions or the effect of a change in policy on economic conditions on the demand for or supply of currency and exchange rates, think about, okay, what is the economic activity? And if you can really tease out how economic activity is a function of the change, that's really going to help send you in the right direction when it comes to using a Forex model to figure out what happens to the exchange rate. So I'm come up with a few examples because I just want to show you how to show changes in demand on exchange rates and changes in supply and exchange rates. So I came up with just a couple of examples. So assume that the US and Canada are trading partners. How will an increase in Canadian consumers' demand for US goods and services affect the value of the US dollar in terms of the Canadian dollar or CAD? So when we're looking at the value of the US dollar, that means we want to market for dollars because we want the value of the US dollar on the vertical axis and the quantity of the US dollar on the horizontal axis. So we have the price of dollars. And in this case, it's the price of one US dollar in CAD. So now we can have a supply for dollars, a demand for dollars curve, an equilibrium exchange rate, and a quantity of dollars. So if Canadian consumers want to buy more US goods and services, they have to purchase more dollars first. So we're going to have an increase in the demand for the US dollar, which drives up the equilibrium exchange rate. So an increase in demand, just like an increase in demand for apples drives up the price of apples, and an increase in demand for cars drives up the price of cars. An increase in the demand for a country's currency is going to cause that country's currency to appreciate in value. Okay, so if you can recognize that, then you can use the model to show an increase in the price of it. Okay, that's a way of checking yourself. Okay, so in this case, the US dollar will appreciate relative to the Canadian dollar. All right, so here's a different example. Assume the US and Canada are trading partners, which is a fair assumption, and that the rate of inflation in the United States rises relative to the rate of inflation in Canada. What happens to the value of the US dollar relative to the CAD? So again, we're looking at the value of the dollar. We want the price of the dollar and the quantity of the dollar. We want a Forex market for the dollar, and we want it in terms of Canadian dollars. So again, supply and demand, equilibrium. So let's think about how economic conditions are going to affect economic actions. If the inflation rate in the United States rises relative to the rate of inflation in Canada, all else equal, Canadian consumers are going to buy less US goods and services. And so we're going to see a decrease in the demand for the dollar because if you're buying fewer US goods and services, you need fewer dollars. The decrease in demand for the dollar is going to cause the exchange rate to fall. It's going to cause the US dollar to depreciate. So you can conclude a decrease in demand for a nation's currency is going to cause that currency to depreciate. Can do the same thing with supply. We're going to go a little bit more quickly. I'm actually using the same examples. I'm just looking at it in terms of the Canadian dollar. So now we want to look at the value of the dollar as a function of what's happening to the change in economic conditions. So we want the price of the Canadian dollar in US dollars on the vertical axis, and we want the quantity of Canadian dollars. So look at all this agreement. We have the price of one CAD, the supply of CAD, the demand for CAD, and the quantity of CAD. So we know we're looking at the market for Canadian dollars in terms of US dollars. All right, so this is going to in order to purchase more US goods and services, we have to give up our Canadian dollars into the foreign exchange market in order to be able to buy US dollars. So we'll see an increase in the supply of the Canadian dollar with a new equilibrium exchange rate that's lower than the initial equilibrium exchange rate. So we can show that an increase in supply of a nation's currency will cause that currency to become less expensive, to depreciate. Okay, so in this case, the CAD will depreciate relative to the dollar. Again, this is why so many teachers teach foreign exchange markets in Unit 1, because conceptually changes in the demand and supply of dollars or Canadian dollars is going to influence the price of those dollars the same way we see in a product market model. So an increase in the supply of anything, all else equal, is going to drive down the price of that thing. All right, so again, now we're going to use those same examples before. That rate of inflation in the US rises relative to the rate of inflation in Canada. What happens to the value of the Canadian dollar relative to the US dollar? So we already know what happens because we saw that one exchange rate can't change on its own. It's always changing relative to something else. So we know which direction it has to go. Let's see if we can show it. So assume the US and Canada are trading partners. The rate of inflation in the US rises relative to the rate of inflation in Canada. What happens to the value of the CAD? So now we want the price of Canadian dollars in US dollars. We want a supply and a demand for CAD curve. We want an initial equilibrium exchange rate. So if the rate of inflation in the US rises, that means the price of goods and services in the US is going to be relatively higher than they are in Canada. People are buying less US goods and services. They're going to demand fewer dollars. They're going to supply less CAD. So the decrease in the supply of CAD is going to drive up the equilibrium exchange rate. So we can conclude that a decrease in the supply of a nation's currency is going to cause that currency I'm sorry, that should say that the CAD will appreciate relative to the US dollar. See, you got to do it really systematically and check yourself. We can see that the CAD is appreciating because of the decrease in the supply of the CAD. All right, so now let's look at these changes in relative incomes and look at this as a change in economic conditions and walk it through all of the changes in economic behavior. So what does this look like, a change in relative income? Well, let's assume real incomes rise in an economy relative to another country. So these are very general statements, but I want to use Canada and the US just to give ourselves some labels in our graphs. Okay, what causes real incomes to rise? This is probably important. You need to recognize it because, yeah, you might see a question that says, what happens to the value of the Canadian dollar or the US dollar when real incomes rise in Canada relative to the US? But more than likely, you're going to see a change in something else that you have to interpret as a change in real incomes. Okay, so remember in the circular flow model back in Unit 2 is probably when it was probably the first thing you learned in Unit 2. The circular flow model describes an economy in terms of the product market and the factor market. And basically what you learned when you studied that is that the value of all the goods and services that are purchased in the product is equal to all of the income earned by the factors of production in the factor market. So when you calculate GDP using the expenditure approach, it's going to be equal to national income using the income approach. So real GDP equals national income, right? And then when you looked at Unit 3 and you started learning the aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph, you saw what you labeled the horizontal axis real GDP, but the symbol you used on the horizontal axis was a Y. Now remember, Y is the symbol for income. So even built into the ADAS model is a reminder that real GDP equals national income. So an increase in real GDP is analogous to an increase in real income. And you can also think about it too in terms of the unemployment rate. If this is a little bit more intuitive for you, increases in real GDP can only be produced by increases with more. You need more workers to produce it. So when there's more workers working, there's more income to be spent. So you want to very closely equate changes in real GDP with changes in national income. So if real GDP rises, national income rises, and spending on all goods and services is going to increase, including imports. And so that's the vehicle through which we need to get into the foreign exchange market. So if we're buying more imports, Canadians are going to increase the supply of the CAD because they have to put their CAD into the foreign exchange market to buy dollars. So this would be a Forex model that we could use to show how the increase in the supply of the CAD is going to cause the CAD to depreciate. But why are they supplying their CAD? So that they can purchase more dollars. So we're going to see an increase in the demand for dollars, which we can graph in a market for dollars by increasing the demand for dollars. So while the increase in the supply of the CAD causes the CAD to depreciate, while the increase in demand for the dollar causes the dollar to appreciate. So we can conclude when there's an increase in real income in an economy relative to other countries, the domestic currency depreciates and the foreign currency appreciates. So let's work through that in reverse. We have real incomes fall in an economy relative to another economy. And this again, we want to recognize that it's a decrease in real GDP or an increase in the unemployment rate, which causes national income to fall. So again, when national income falls, people buy fewer of all goods and services, including imports. So if we're buying fewer imports, we're going to supply less CAD in the foreign exchange market. The decrease in the supply of the CAD is going to cause it to appreciate. And we're going to want fewer dollars because we're buying fewer imports from the United States. So there's going to be a corresponding decrease in demand for the dollar, which is going to cause it to depreciate. So this is sometimes counterintuitive to kids. If real incomes fall, the domestic currency appreciates, right? This sounds like a bad thing. This sounds like a good thing. So those two things wouldn't be happening together. But if you work through the steps, you can see how a fall in real income will cause the domestic currency to appreciate. And there are winners and losers, right? When domestic currency appreciates, um, that creates winners and losers in an economy. All right, now what about a change in relative inflation rates? Well, we've sort of snuck into this one already with our practice problems, but let's just go through it systematically. When inflation rates rise in a domestic economy relative to another country, let's see the effect on the forex market and exchange rates. So how would we recognize a change in inflation rates? Well, it might tell us in the problem, inflation rates rise, but it might also say a change in the price level. And so when you read it, how does an increase in the price level in country A affect the value of country A's currency relative to the currency of country B? You want to think, okay, how does a change in the price level affect economic activity? So foreign goods, when there's an increase in the rate at which prices are increasing in one country relative to others, it means that that country's goods and services are relatively more expensive and imports become relatively less expensive. So when foreign goods and services become relatively less expensive, we're going to buy more of them. And hopefully now you're starting to anticipate where this is going to go. If we're going to buy more imports, we have to increase the supply of the domestic currency, which causes it to depreciate. But we're doing that so we can buy more of the foreign currency, which we shows an increase in demand of the foreign currency, which causes the foreign currency to appreciate. Okay, so an increase in the inflation rate in a domestic economy causes the domestic currency to depreciate and the foreign currency to appreciate. So you want to recognize, what are you seeing happen? How does that affect economic activity? And then how is that economic activity reflected in the foreign exchange market? Okay, those are the steps you want to be able to take. Let's work it in reverse. If we see a decrease in the domestic price level relative to the price level in other countries, we want to recognize that foreign goods and services are becoming relatively more expensive. Domestic goods and services prices are rising at a slower rate than the prices of goods and services in other countries. So domestic goods and services are relatively cheaper, foreign goods and services are relatively more expensive. So that's going to cause spending on imports to decrease. It's going to decrease the supply of CAD in the forex market because we're buying less foreign currency. So when the supply of the currency, domestic currency decreases, it appreciates. We're going to decrease demand for the foreign currency, in this case, the US dollar. And so the foreign currency is going to depreciate. Okay, so we've worked through two of the three major changes in economic conditions that you want to understand the influence of in terms of currency values. The last one is change in interest rates. This one is a little bit more confusing because when you have a change in relative interest rates, you're going to really be seeing changes in behavior from both sides. Okay, so I've picked one side to walk through, but when we get to topic 6.6 on Friday and we look at real interest rate and capital flows, we're going to take it through both sides of the equation. All right, so let's say interest rates fall in an economy relative to those in another country. This could be caused by any variety of things, but fundamentally, where are we looking at the price of money? We're looking in the money market and the loanable funds market. So a decrease in interest rates would result from a decrease in nominal interest rates in the money market or a decrease in real interest rates in the loanable funds market. And it's not important to get hung up on those details. You want to read a change in nominal interest rates. Well, in the short run, remember nominal and real interest rates move together. And in the long run or the long term, when we're looking at real interest rates, it's a major driver of economic behavior as well. So regardless, we don't necessarily have to distinguish between short or long-term interest rates right now. We can just say all else equal, if interest rates in one country fall relative to interest rates in another country, how is economic behavior going to change? What we're going to see is that domestic savers, right, the people who have savings in a domestic economy, in this case, Canada, are going to seek interest-bearing financial assets in other countries. So think about it this way. If you can save your money in the bank for 5% in your own country, or you can save your money in a bank in a foreign country and earn 10%, where are you going to want to save your money? As a saver, you seek the highest rate of return on your savings. So all else equal, when interest rates in a domestic economy fall, we want to buy financial assets or interest-bearing assets in other countries. Okay, now I bet you can figure out what we're going to do next. We're going to increase the supply. In this case, the domestic economy is Canada, remember. So all those Canadians who know that interest rates are relatively higher in other countries, who decide they want to save their money in other countries, whether they buy financial assets, whether they buy bonds or put their money in a money market account in another country, or however they choose to earn interest. When interest rates are higher elsewhere, they want to increase the supply of their own currency in the foreign exchange market, which causes it to depreciate, and they want to purchase the currency of the country whose financial assets are earning higher rates of return. So in this case, there'd be an increase in the demand for the foreign currency, which causes that currency to appreciate. So see how systematically we want to work through these things. Okay. All right, let's do it the other way. Interest rates rise in a domestic economy relative to another country. This again would be caused by an increase in nominal interest rates in the money market or other short-term short-term markets, increase in the real interest rate in the loanable funds market. Regardless, if interest rates in a domestic economy rise, two things are going to happen. Domestic savers are going to be less willing to buy financial assets in foreign countries, right? But foreign savers are going to be more willing to buy financial assets in a domestic economy. So how are we going to show that? Well, if money wants to come into Canada to buy Canadian financial assets, there's going to be an increase in demand for the Canadian dollar. That's going to cause the equilibrium exchange rate or the price of the dollar to rise. That's going to cause the domestic currency to appreciate. And again, in order to buy domestic currency, in order to buy Canadian dollars to purchase Canadian financial assets, they're going to have to increase the supply of their own currency in the financial, in the Forex market. So when you increase the supply of the dollar, the exchange rate falls and the US dollar in this case is going to depreciate. So those are the three major changes in economic conditions that you would be expected to be able to walk through from the change to the exchange rate. Okay, and we've just done that very systematically. So this reasoning process is something you really want to be able to do. Now let's see if we can put this all together. All right, so changes in economic conditions on foreign exchange rates. So we have an increase in relative income. Here's how the economic activity changes. Here's what happens to the supply of the domestic currency, the demand for the foreign currency, and what happens to the exchange rates. So you might be asked a question where you go from an increase in relative income right to the exchange rate, and you've got to walk through the whole thing. You might have to go from, there's an increase in imports. What happens to the exchange rate? You want to be able to walk through, but make sure you're going very systematically through this reasoning. I did the same thing, an increase in the relative price level. This is just a review of what we saw in the graphs. Once you get really comfortable with this reasoning, you don't necessarily need a graph, but I would recommend that you always give yourself a little sketch. If you're increasing the supply or you're increasing the demand, how are the currency values changing? Right? And then finally, changes in relative interest rates. Here's how a change in relative interest rates affects economic activity. Here's how the demand, the supply of the domestic currency and the demand for foreign currency is going to change. All right, we did the same thing working through a decrease. This is the kind of chart I would recommend that all my students be able to do on their own. I would give them a graphic organizer, I'd give them the prompts, and I'd have them walk through the reasoning, the changes in the demand and supply of currency, and the changes in the currency values. So this might be a really good practice for you to do on your own at home. All right, so again, we're just putting it all together. A decrease in relative interest rates makes domestic savers buy more in domestic interest rates, makes financial assets in other countries more appealing. Okay, so they're going to increase the supply of their domestic currency. They're going to increase the demand for foreign currency, and so we'll see the domestic currency. The domestic currency will depreciate, and the foreign currency will appreciate. All right, so now, the second and third essential knowledge statements for topic 6.4 connect those economic conditions to monetary and fiscal policy. So what you need to know is that fiscal policy can influence aggregate demand, real output, the price level, and exchange rates. So you already knew that fiscal policy could influence aggregate demand, real output, the price level. And now we're going to connect it to exchange rates. Same thing for monetary policy, right? It can influence aggregate demand, real output, the price level, and interest rates, and consequently exchange rates. So let's talk about this a little bit and then put both parts together. Let's start with what fiscal and monetary policies would produce an increase in aggregate demand. So we know that expansionary policies are designed to stimulate aggregate spending. Okay, expansionary policies, direct spending by the government is going to increase aggregate demand. A decrease in taxes is going to indirectly influence aggregate demand. When you cut taxes, people have more disposable income, they spend more money, C goes up. How about expansionary monetary policies? Also indirect. So in order to get from expansionary monetary policy that increases the money supply, right, the goal would be to increase interest rate sensitive spending in our aggregate demand expenditures, including interest rate sensitive consumption and a lot of investment spending. So there's really only one expansionary monetary policy tool. It's increasing the money supply. The question is, how do they do that? And the three most commonly discussed tools in a Principles of Macro course, there are several other tools. If you're watching the news, if you're watching the Fed, you know the Fed is currently engaged in many other tools right now to try to keep interest rates really, really low in order to stimulate aggregate demand. But we know that decreasing the reserve requirement, decreasing the discount rate, and buying bonds are all designed to make the money supply bigger, which is designed to drive down interest rates and increase spending. All right, now let's connect that to how do those expansionary policies affect our major economic conditions: relative income, relative inflation rates, and relative interest rates. And the answer is, for each one, it kind of depends. So let's think about it. When if you're in the short run and your short run aggregate supply is horizontal or upward sloping, an increase in aggregate demand generates an increase in real GDP. And unless you're told otherwise, you should assume in the short run you have an upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. When the short run aggregate supply, now what about inflation rates? So when the short run aggregate supply curve is horizontal, an increase in aggregate demand causes an increase in output in real GDP and an increase in employment, but there's no change on the price level, okay? When the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping or vertical, increases in aggregate demand will produce increases in the price level. So both expansionary monetary and expansionary fiscal policy are designed to increase real income and not designed to, but in the short run, a consequence, as we learned in the Phillips curve, when we studied the Phillips curve, and short run increase in real GDP, in a short run increase in employment is accompanied by a short run increase in inflation. Now, what about relative interest rates? And here the answer is really, it depends, because expansionary fiscal policy often drives up interest rates, but expansionary monetary policy is designed to drive down interest rates. So unless you know which policy is having a stronger effect on real interest rates, you can't say with any certainty. But you will often read a question that asks about the effect of fiscal policy on the loanable funds model, on the real interest rate. And then once you've got your interest rate set up in the loanable funds model, you can take it from there. I've also seen examples of questions that talk about monetary policy and the effect on interest rates, and then take it from there. So chances are you won't be asked the effect of simultaneous expansionary monetary fiscal policy on the exchange rate, but it wouldn't be a bad idea to walk yourself through how to approach answering that kind of a question. All right, now what about contractionary policies? So fiscal and monetary policies that will lead to a decrease in aggregate demand or oh, God darn, another mistake. That should say contractionary, obviously. So a contractionary fiscal policy is a decrease in government spending and an increase in taxes. Sorry, it was coming down to the wire on this time-wise. Now, contractionary monetary policy is a decrease in the money supply, which is produced by an increase in the reserve requirement, an increase in the discount rate, or an open market sale of bonds. So please make sure, if you're taking notes, we're looking at contractionary fiscal policies as a decrease in government spending or transfers, and an increase, look at the arrow, an increase in taxes. And this should say contractionary monetary policy is a decrease in the money supply, which is generated by one of these three Fed tools. All right, so now how do contractionary policies affect relative income, relative inflation rates, and relative interest rates? So you should be able to do the same thing. The, the goal of contractionary policy is to decrease aggregate demand. And so when short-run aggregate supply is horizontal or upward sloping, a decrease in aggregate demand leads to a decrease in real GDP, which would produce a decrease in national income. Now, what about inflation rates? Well, when the short-run aggregate supply curve is horizontal, there's no change in the price level when aggregate demand goes down. But if aggregate supply is upward sloping or vertical, then a decrease in aggregate demand will lead to a decrease in the price level. And the same answer is true for interest rates. Contractionary policies, one will put upward pressure on contractionary monetary policy would put upward pressure on interest rates, and contractionary fiscal policy would put downward pressure on interest rates. Okay, so I'm going to bring this chart back up. And so now we can put our policies in with our change in economic conditions. And this would be a great tool for you to have. We know that expansionary policies are designed to increase aggregate demand, to increase real GDP, and to increase which increases real income. We know that expansionary policies in the short run are often accompanied by increases in the price level. And when it comes to real interest rates, we want to take a look. Expansionary fiscal policy would drive up interest rates, and contractionary monetary policy would drive up interest rates. Okay, and then all of this is the same. So we already know how the change in economic conditions affects economic activity, affects currencies, supply and demand, and affects the exchange rate. And now we're just connecting some policies to those changes in economic conditions. And we can do it for decreases in relative income, relative prices, and the relative interest rates as well. Okay, so maybe after watching this video, you want to give yourself create a graphic organizer where you put these as your column headings and you put these on as your rows, and see if you can work through and reason through each of these steps. And that's really it. That's really putting it all together. So I threw one multiple choice question in here so you could see how it looks. Assume that the inflation rate in country X is very high relative to the inflation rates of all its trading partners. What does that mean? It means country X's prices are rising faster than those in other countries. Demand for country X's goods and services is going to decrease, which is going to cause the demand for country X's currency to go down. So the demand for the currency will shift to the left. And when the demand for the currency shifts to the left, it depreciates. All right, I pulled up a short FRQ from about 15 years ago, because this one was actually not a graphing question. So since you're not going to be graphing as you answer questions on the FRQ this year, I thought that it would be a good idea to do more practice with our reasoning and our explain points. So we have a loanable funds model, and we're asked to assume that the country's government increases deficit spending, and to explain how the increase in deficit spending will affect the real interest rate. Well, we know deficit spending must be financed by borrowing. It's going to increase the demand for loanable funds, which is going to drive up the real interest rates. So when you see that word explain, chances are you're going to need to say why or explain how, and because is a really good way of doing that. All right, then part B asks us to indicate how the real interest rate change identified in part A would affect investment in plant and equipment. Well, this is a connection we've been making for quite some time now. We know that when the real interest rate rises due to government spending, private investment spending is crowded out. I'm sorry, when real interest rates rise due to government borrowing, private domestic investment spending decreases, and that's what spending on plant and equipment is. And then, of course, we're asked what happens to economic growth. And so when we are decreasing our investment spending, we're decreasing the rate at which we're adding capital stock, decreasing the rate of capital formation, decreasing the rate at which productive capacity is added to our economy. And so when real interest rates rise, long-term economic growth rate slows. All right, and now finally, here's our new bit, part D. Explain how the real interest rate change you identified will affect the demand for the country's currency and the value of that currency. So because the real interest rate rises, that incentivizes people to save their money in the country with the higher interest rates. That's going to lead to capital inflow. People in a domestic, foreigners want to save their money now in this country with higher real interest rates, which is going to cause the demand for the country's currency to increase. And so when the demand for a currency increases, that causes the exchange rate to rise. So there's an answer to a short FRQ that has no graphing in it. There's one, when you see indicate, or if you say state, or will it go up, down, or stay the same, they're only looking for an answer. When you see that word explain, you want to make sure that you're showing your reasoning and be as complete as you feel you need to show how you get to your answer. Okay, so we did a lot tonight. We did a lot tonight, and the goal was for you to be able to explain the determinants of currency demand and supply. Hopefully you feel you have a really good insight into that now. And then how, once we change demand or supply, what happens to exchange rates? And here, really, we spent some time on those changes in economic conditions that influence demand and supply of currency, but then we really connected it to monetary and fiscal policy. So you could see the effect of policies on exchange rates. So that's what you should be able to do now. Recognize the determinants of the demand for and supply of a currency, and you should be able to use a Forex market to show how changes in the demand and supply would affect exchange rates, and then explain how fiscal and monetary policy would influence the economic conditions that influence ultimately exchange rates. So that is good timing. All right. So I'm going to leave you with this question. Puts it all together, what we've been talking about. We're starting with some monetary policy. Okay, then we're ending with the international value of a currency. So you want to be able to apply everything you learned from tonight in this question. All right, as always, if you're watching, now would be a great time to take a picture if you're watching live. If you're not watching live, go ahead and pause it and take a crack at it. And this is the question that Mr. Romano will pick up with tomorrow. Okay, finally, the same message we've been giving at the end of all of our lessons. If you or someone you know needs device or connectivity in order to be able to take their AP exam, please don't hesitate to reach out to cb.org/tech in order for the College Board to be able to help you. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for your time tonight. Have a good evening.